So what are we going to do today, Cousin BW?
The same thing we do every day, Melvin. Try to take over the neighborhood. Hey y'all. Bloodwing here. Back to bring some grumpiness to the internet. You know, I've often said that I'm an old fart. No use denying it. Which means that I probably remember some things and events that some of you don't. I think some of my subscribers are about my age, but many of you probably aren't. And one of those things I remember is when MTV actually was music television, in that they had nothing but wall-to-wall videos. And it was great.
Ooh-wee, Cousin BW, you said a mouthful. I remember those days. You could turn on the TV and see your favorite artist, and a lot of them you didn't know about got introduced to, like Prince, and Michael Jackson, and The Police, and Van Halen, and the Stray Cats, and Flock of Seagulls.
Whoa there, Melvin. I was with you at first, but up until that last one. Maybe not so much that one. Yeah, that's, not everything about the 80s was great. But you're right, there was a lot of big names that were on MTV, and a lot of what weren't so big names at that time and became big names later simply because they were featured on MTV a lot. I'm not here to go into all of that, but if any of you remember MTV, you know I'm right. And there's a lasting legacy. No artist of any music genre today is worth their salt if they don't make a video about any single they might release. It might not be played on MTV anymore, because it certainly has become anything but music. A lot of SJW garbage. So that brings us to the video that we have today. Yes, it's from MTV, and by now you've probably guessed, yes, it's Franchesca Ramsey. I've made it very clear that I'm not a very political person, and I really don't have a dog in this fight in this election. I just really don't care one way or the other. They're both garbage, of the two main political candidates. But this is not about politics, although it might appear so on the surface. It's about pure SJW racist garbage. So without further ado, Scooter, roll that beautiful bean footage.
Man, this is one of them moments. Catch a ride!
Showing ID before you vote is no big deal. Everyone has ID, right? In case you haven't noticed, the presidential election is almost here. Soon, everybody can go to the polls and cast their ballots to decide the fate of America. Well, almost everybody.
Now I want you to pay attention to who just was snatched out of that line. Of course, it was the black, elderly woman. You know, all three of those are important.
Since 2008, 10 states have successfully implemented strict voter ID laws that are meant to prevent voter fraud, but in reality, make it harder for a lot of people to vote.
Now I want you to pay attention to that map she just showed and the states that are highlighted on it. That'll come up important here in a little bit. And shoot, you never know when there might be a pop quiz.
3 of them make you show either a photo ID, like a driver's license, or non-photo ID, like a bill with your name on it, before you can vote at the polls. The other 7 will only let you vote if you have a photo ID.
That is absolutely incorrect. You are totally wrong. And in fact, that's a bold-faced lie, Franchesca, and you know it. Now, just remember, because I'll get to it in a minute why it's a lie.
So depending on where you live, what you need to do to vote in our national election can be totally different. America! So why have these laws popped up recently? Well, in theory, they prevent voters from impersonating someone else. That way we can all feel confident in the accuracy of the election process without worrying that some kid is sneaking into the polls wearing mustache glasses. Yo, 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 fake IDs, vote twice!
It's not just in theory, Franchesca. As a matter of fact, the concerns that came about to these laws actually goes back to the 2000 presidential election. Or are you too young to remember that, Franchesca? Probably. You only read it out of a history book. You know, when George Bush was running and all of those votes had to be recounted in Florida, and the paranoia that rose from that. Do you remember that? At the time, a Pew Research Center survey found that 48% of Americans were confident that the votes across the country were accurately counted in the 2004 election. However, since then, they'd done a poll again in 2012, and the percentage fell to 31%. People don't believe that it's on the up and up. And that's where these laws come from. Not what you're about to say they are. And yes, you're right. You're probably ahead of me. She's going to say it's because of racism. But I know this is the reason that it come about. Because one of the states involved, and again we'll get to that in a minute, their laws and the time frame that they happened are absolutely not as she presents them. In fact, she's way off the mark.
But here's the thing. The kind of fraud voter ID laws claim to prevent practically never happens. In fact, a report concluded that voter impersonation is rarer than being struck by lightning. Even FoxNews.com reported that this kind of voter fraud rarely happens. Wait, did I just agree with Fox News? Oh my God!
This is the only partially correct statement I think that she probably makes during this whole video. There is controversy on whether or not the laws are needed, and there's controversy on whether they're even effective. That is true. However, just because something is rare, does that mean that there shouldn't be a law against it? For instance, bestiality is probably one of the rarest crimes in the U.S. Latest figures put it at about 4.9% for men, 1.9% of the population for women. That's pretty low. But are you saying then that it shouldn't be illegal? I mean, no matter what your idea on sexual preference is, there still comes up the question of animal abuse. You know, just because something is rare doesn't mean that it shouldn't be against the law. And there should be laws against voter fraud, and there should be action taken against voter fraud.
Why even bother having voter ID laws at all? Good old-fashioned voter suppression with a dash of racism and classism for good measure.
I told you she was going to get there. Somehow it was going to be racist. And with her it always is. In fact, I've come to the conclusion that Franchesca is one of the most outwardly racist people on YouTube, which is odd considering I understand that she has a white husband. That poor fellow must be cooked to death.
Requiring voters to have ID seems like a harmless precaution until you realize the majority of people lacking ID are either elderly, poor, and aren't white. And frequently, they're all three. Statistically, African American and Latinx voters are much less likely than white voters to have the qualifying IDs required by states with voter ID laws.
First of all, she's already forgetting what she's already said. Remember a minute ago when she talked about the states that have laws initially? Some of them you can present a utility bill as an ID. Now, no matter who you are, everybody's got bills to pay. You can present a utility bill. But what about the states that only accept, according to her, picture ID? Why do you think it is that the group that she mentioned, the black and Latino. I refuse to use that other word. It's so stupid. Why do you think black and Latinos might not have an ID? Most states, you got to drive to get around. There's a picture ID. The states that require picture ID will also accept military ID if you're in the military. The only reason I can think of that you might not have some ID is that, one, you never got a license out of those two groups, out of the blacks and Latinos, or you're illegal, or you're, for other reasons, living off the grid. Like, maybe you're a criminal? Now, out of the initial group, the only ones I could see that might have a legitimate complaint about not being able to get a picture ID are perhaps the elderly. If they were born before record keeping was really well done. For instance, my dad had a really hard time coming up with a birth certificate because he wasn't even born in a hospital. He was born in the middle of the hills of Kentucky, way back off the roads, in a house. So finding a birth certificate was extremely hard for him. But there are ways around that, at least in some of these states. And again, we'll get to that. I know I keep saying it, but I'm going to drop a big bomb on her here in a minute. I'm just giving her enough rope to hang herself with first.
They're also disproportionately likely to be low income. Even when a state offers free photo ID, these residents may not be able to afford the underlying documents, transportation, or time required to get one.
And what about, Franchesca? What about if it only takes the cost of a stamp? And I'll clarify that again in a minute.
Many Republicans pushing for voter ID claim the laws have nothing to do with race or class. But in 2013, North Carolina County Precinct GOP Chair Don Yelton told The Daily Show that if the state's new voter ID rule hurts a bunch of lazy blacks who just want the government to give them everything, so be it.
Of course, in her mind, it only has to be Republicans that want this, and probably predominantly is. And of course, she has to pick the most outlandish example of someone in the Republican Party speaking out against it. I'm sure he does not speak for the entire Republican Party. And at the time that he done it is long after a lot of these states made their laws. And I'll prove that again here in just a moment. But I kind of sort of agree with what he said. I wouldn't have said black. But you take that out of it, if there's a lot of lazy people that don't want to go out and get an ID, unless there's some really good reason why you can't when it's so easy, because in most states it's free, and she'll discount that too. But, it's too bad. Too bad. It's a pretty small price to pay to help cut out any voter fraud that somebody might get in their idea. And this election cycle would be a perfect time for somebody to try to fast one and do some voter fraud because of the divisiveness of these two candidates that we have.
Tell us how you really feel, Don. And speaking of North Carolina, they passed a law that imposed strict photo ID requirements on voters, in addition to ending voter registration outreach programs that historically increased black voter turnout. Thankfully, this past July, a federal appeals court actually struck down North Carolina's voter ID laws, claiming they targeted African Americans with almost surgical precision.
I'm actually really amazed here that she didn't take this opportunity to point out that it's not the only state that got their voter ID laws either struck down or watered down by the Supreme Court. I'll admit there were some others, but the problem with them wasn't the idea of the law or the law itself, but in the way the idiot politicians wrote them. They didn't write them out well enough, and if they had taken the time to think of every contingency and write them out with good language, they wouldn't have got struck down, and I can prove that. Again, I know I keep saying later, but I'm sorry. You're just going to have to wait till I get to that information.
See, voter ID laws are a classic example of structural racism, which is what makes racism different from prejudice. Prejudice is the individual dislike of a class of people based on a superficial characteristic or stereotype.
Almost, Franchesca. But not quite. No cigar. Let's see what the dictionaries, or at least those online, say about it. Dictionary.com says prejudice is an unfavorable opinion or feeling formed beforehand or without knowledge, thought, or reason. Any preconceived opinion or feeling, either favorable or unfavorable, unreasonable feelings, opinions, or attitudes, especially of a hostile nature regarding an ethnic, racial, social, or religious group. Such attitudes considered collectively or damage or injury, detriment. Let's not just take one. Let's look at what Merriam-Webster say. Injury or damage resulting from some judgment or action of another in disregard of one's rights. Preconceived judgment or opinion, an adverse opinion or leaning formed without just grounds or before sufficient knowledge, an instance of such judgment or opinion. So I didn't see anything in there about individual or individual dislike, but you almost got that one right. It's the next definition that you all of you always mess up terribly. I bet you listeners can't guess what that is.
Racism is racial prejudice plus structural oppression and power that negatively impacts a group.
Now see, there's a reason why I pointed out that she wasn't exactly correct on her definition of prejudice, because she tried to say that that was individual. And as we all know by now, because it's getting pretty tired, they're saying that racism has to be systematic. What they're defining really is systematic racism, but it doesn't mean that individual racism doesn't exist. So let's test her definition, because why are we supposed to believe her definition just because she said so? See, I like to think my users are smarter than that. I like to think that my users will go and check things on themselves. I don't even want them to take my word for it. Go check it out for yourself. Do some research. I think all of my listeners are completely smart enough to make up their own minds and do their own research. It's why most of us give you links to their videos, to our sources, and what have you. But let's take a look again at the definition in the dictionaries. I know this is tired. I know we beat this dead horse to no end, but they just don't seem to get it. Let's see. Merriam-Webster first says that racism is a belief that race is the primary detriment of human traits and capacities, and that racial differences produce an inherent superiority of a particular race. A doctrine or political program based on the assumption of racism is designed to execute its principles. A political or social system founded on racism. So let's check what dictionary.com says. A belief or doctrine that inherent differences among the various human racial groups determine cultural or individual achievements, usually involving the idea that one's own race is superior and has the right to dominate others, or that a particular racial group is inferior to the others. A policy, system of government, etc., based upon or fostering such a doctrine, discrimination, hatred, or intolerance of another race or other races. And shoot, why not? Let's get a third. Oxford Dictionary says prejudice, discrimination, or antagonism directed against someone of a different race based on the belief that one's own race is superior. And that definition actually includes prejudice, which she said was something else. But this says it's the same thing. The belief that all members of each race possess characteristics, abilities, or qualities specific to that race, especially so as to distinguish it as inferior or superior to another race or races. Now, a couple of those definitions did include portions of the definitions as being something that can be part of a system of government, but it's not the only definition that is systematic. They all include definitions that are individual. It's just their way of saying that only white people can be racist, no other race can be racist because they're not in power. And the dictionary definitions do not hold that up. So the only thing I can imagine that they all keep getting this definition that it has to be by somebody in power or whatever, or systematic, is they're pulling it out of their butts.
Structural racism often exists in the form of policies or laws that may or may not seem overtly racist, but ultimately cause negative consequences for people of color. Pop quiz! What's the best way to make sure racist laws stay on the books and new rules aren't put into place? Ooh, I know! Make it really difficult for people of color to vote! And that has a long history in America. After the Civil War, the 15th Amendment was ratified, making it illegal to deny a male citizen the right to vote based on race. But that didn't stop election officials from falsely telling black voters they'd gotten the date wrong or that they were in the wrong polling place. Other voters were told they had to pass a literacy test first. Some were even forced to recite the entire Constitution. Really? Who can do that without Google? Fast forward to the civil rights movement in the 1960s. After the violent attack by state troopers on peaceful activists protesting in Selma, Alabama, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was passed, which explicitly made voter discrimination illegal. Because of the act, turnout of black voters increased tremendously. Of course, not everyone was happy about this. Some states took issue with Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, which required states with a history of voter discrimination to seek federal approval before making changes to voter laws. This was basically the federal government's way of looking at states who've been shady towards voters in the past and letting them know, we see you.
Well, at least you didn't blame it on slavery itself. But so you give two examples, one 150 years ago, another one 50 years ago. Yeah, bad things happened. And you even admit laws were made to change that. And yes, people done bad things to get around those laws, but that's pretty much fixed. I mean, I can't remember in my recent history, and I'm 56 years old, people blocking the voting polls to keep black people or Latino or old people out. I don't understand your point here. This is practically ancient history that you're talking about.
In 2013, in the case of Shelby County versus Holder, lawmakers argued enough time had passed that it was no longer fair to make these states undergo the extra approval because, racism is over. The Supreme Court agreed. So after Shelby versus Holder, states like Alabama were free to change election laws without approval from the Justice Department. And many of them took advantage of this to create the voter ID laws we see today.
Now remember when I told you to pay attention to that map a while ago? Well, let's take another look at that map as she shows it this time. And let's pay particular attention to the state I have circled on the map at this time.
Hey, Cousin BW. Ain't that there Indiana? Ain't that the state we live in?
Very good, Melvin. You actually got that right. It is indeed. It is where we live. And this state and what's happened with it is what proves that Franchesca is a complete liar and has misrepresented everything. Now remember, she said that the law that allowed all this happened in 2013, so that all of the states changed their laws at that point in time. She also said that all the states that require photo ID only accept photo ID. So let's take a look at Indiana and see what makes it a little different than some of the others. First, let's take a look at an article on the website The Daily Signal titled After Voter ID Defeats, Lessons from Indiana's Law That Has Stood Test of Time. Now I'm not going to read this whole article because it's pretty long, and there's a second article I want to get to real quick. But this article does have a couple of points I also want to point out. It deals with Indiana's Secretary of State Connie Lawson. But I want to start where it says, more than a decade ago, before it was the rage to do so, Lawson, then a Republican state legislator, co-sponsored a bill in the name of preserving election integrity that requires Indiana voters to produce photo identification. 3 years after the legislation became law in 2005, the Supreme Court upheld it as constitutional, and today, Lawson, as the state's chief elections official, is describing Indiana's photo identification law as a success story. She says it's a triumph that states discouraged by recent court rulings should learn from. When we wrote the legislation, we did everything we could to make elections honest and make sure everyone can participate in the election process, Lawson told the Daily Signal in an interview. So we added protections against disenfranchisement that maybe some of the other laws don't have. And now our law has stood the test of time. It passed the test with the U.S. Supreme Court, and it has been in place for over a decade now. Remember, she said that Franchesca said the law that spurred all this was overturned in 2013. Indiana's had its laws in place in 2005. It was way ahead of the curve. Lawson says that the turnout for presidential elections has increased since the law's implementation. It jumped from 58% in 2004 to 62% in 2008, a year when President Barack Obama became the first Democrat to carry Indiana since 1964. Turnout fell back to 58% in 2012, which is probably for many other reasons. So instead of discouraging voter turnout, it actually encouraged it to where more people, black people, came out and voted, and actually voted in the first Democrat that my state has voted in since the 60s. It has predominantly, my entire life, always been a red or Republican state. So yeah, it didn't discourage anything. It actually encouraged it. Isn't that funny? It goes on to say, and she contends there is no compelling evidence to prove voters are being blocked from the ballot box because of stricter identification requirements, although she says it's impossible to measure whether the law has prevented a case of an in-person voter fraud. And there are reasons behind why Indiana's law is successful, and other laws are starting to take hints from it, by the way, and restructuring their laws to more closely match what Indiana has already done for over a decade with this voter registration ID law. So I want to jump over to a much shorter article at the Chicago Post-Tribune, where it says Indiana voter ID law differs from recent overturned rulings. Now this one I will read all, or at least most of, because it's a much shorter article. Indiana's voter identification laws differs from recently overturned laws in other states that legal experts say have caused disenfranchisement among minorities. The U.S. Supreme Court upheld Indiana's law in the 2008 decision in Crawford versus Marion County Election Board, inspiring more strict laws that federal courts have struck down, the Bloomington Herald-Times reported. Michael Pitts, a professor of law and a Dean's Fellow at Indiana University's Robert H. McKinney School of Law in Indianapolis, said the state's voter ID law provides ways to get around showing photo identification. So remember when she said it was strict, those that require voter or the ID, picture ID, that's all they accept? Not true, Franchesca. Look at Indiana. People older than 65 can vote an absentee ballot via mail without showing identification, and there's an opportunity to sign an affidavit saying a person can't obtain an ID because of serious financial limitations or religious objections to being photographed. And there are a few religious beliefs that are against being photographed, and I'm not going to get all into that, but even that can be got around because they made it possible for people to remember. She kicked out the black lady with the walker as being the one most left out. Yeah, they can vote from home at the cost of a stamp. The same can't be said for laws that follow the 2008 decision upholding Indiana's law, experts said. So laws that were made after it, they weren't as careful. These other states that are getting struck down. Luis Fuentes Rower, a professor of law and Harry T. Ice faculty fellow at Indiana University's Mars School of Law in Bloomington, said the landscape has changed since the April 2008 U.S. Supreme Court ruling, and people can now show how some of these laws have caused deprived minorities the right to vote. Beth Kate, an associate professor at IU School of Public and Environmental Affairs, said the recent cases show that Congress needs to enact new standards to rein in states that would enact laws disproportionately affecting ethnic and racial minorities. Pitts said that in the recent cases, courts largely have tended to make narrow revisions or write opinions that apply in certain instances. That kind of challenge is a high legal standard that's difficult to meet, according to Kate. Experts said that none of this means that someone couldn't be successful by challenging the state law, but that the scenario isn't likely. Somebody would need to present better proof that a decent number of people who want to vote are having trouble getting the identification necessary to vote in the state of Indiana, and that proof has yet to be generated. What is also true, and didn't show, but is also true, you can use military ID. If you don't have a driver's license, personal IDs are free. So the only cost is the cost of getting to the Bureau of Motor Vehicles to get your ID made. And if you're elderly and can't make it, you can mail it in. If you can prove that you have a religious objection, you can get around on that case. Yes, some of the states have been getting knocked down. That's because they didn't pay enough attention to Indiana. And done properly, done right, this has absolutely nothing to do with racism or keeping people of non-white races out of the election polls. As a matter of fact, as I already stated, it spurred an increase in voter reaction and got a Democrat elected into office. So, yeah, Franchesca, you've been really disingenuous with this. In fact, you flat out lied. And I almost bet you knew that. But you just skimmed right over it. You put Indiana on the map, but you didn't show that it was long before this 2013 date that you made, and that it actually worked the opposite of what you're claiming all this happens. But that wouldn't fit your racist agenda, would it?
Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who dissented from the decision, said, "Throwing out pre-clearance when it has worked and is continuing to work to stop discriminatory changes is like throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you are not getting wet. And when it comes to racism, it's still raining a lot."
Yeah, Franchesca, it's still raining, but mostly from your side. It's Black Lives Matter and all of that I see throwing out all the racist accusations and acting in a racist manner, blaming white people for everything. But you know, it's like anything else. My mom used to say, if you look for trouble, you're going to find it. And if you're always looking for racism, you're going to find it everywhere, even without your tinfoil hat.
Why does all this matter? Well, beyond ensuring every American has the right to vote, the key to ending structural racism is by replacing it with a better structure. It isn't just about people changing their racist behaviors.
Wait a minute, I'm confused. Didn't you just say that racism has to be systematic? That when it's an individual, it's prejudice? But here you say people change their racist views? Isn't that double talk? Isn't that a contradiction?
Although that's certainly part of it, it's also about reassessing the way those behaviors get written into the very laws on which our country stands. And if you're not sure what you need to do to vote in your state, our friends John and Hank Green put together a great YouTube channel called How to Vote in Every State. You should also check out MTV's electthis.com to learn more about the election. We'll put links to both sites in the description box so you can make sure your voice is heard this November. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time right here on Decoded.
So there you have it. These people will find racism anywhere, even if they have to make it up. Because, you know, it's everywhere. It's raining. What's next? They're going to make the weather racist? Oh, wait a minute. They already did. Anyway, that's all the time I got for today. So as always, get out of my yard.